Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zone. On behalf of the students and faculty of the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University, I am delighted to welcome you to the second day of our conference, Transprofessional Diplomacy, Deepening Collaboration Among Governmental and Non-Governmental Diplomatic Actors. My name is David Wellman, and I have the honor of being the director of the Gray School. The mission of the Gray School is to train future practitioners of diplomacy across all vocations, from those pursuing careers in the Foreign Service to those who want to build bridges in their own neighborhoods as community organizers and activists. The goal of the Gray School is to create cohorts of students with a wide range of vocational trajectories who engage the study and practice of diplomacy together, and in so doing, establish networks that they will take with them as they pursue their respective careers upon graduation. It is this goal that informs the theme of our conference. So before we begin our first panel of the day, I'd like to once again express my profound gratitude to the many people who made this conference possible. I'd like to begin by thanking Noé Cornago from the University of the Basque Country, who played a central role in the design of this conference and in the identification of a number of the people we invited to appear as panelists. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Leah Hasdan and Sarah Brown, for all their invaluable logistical and technical work to make this webinar possible. And a very special thanks goes to the students, faculty, advisory boards, and donors of the Gray School, whose energy, teaching, curricular, financial, and intellectual contributions have made our school possible. Finally, on behalf of everyone at the Gray School, I want to express my deepest gratitude to all the extraordinary panelists who have so generously given of their valuable time and wisdom to bring this conference into existence. You have truly honored us with your presence and participation in this gathering. So, as I mentioned, at the Gray School, we come from the perspective of a transprofessional lens on diplomacy, and I could not think of a better panel to embody that goal and that mission of our school, because you are about to hear from, in this order, a philosopher of religion, a foreign service officer, and a human rights activist who heads a major NGO. So our panel, this first panel this morning, is entitled Diplomacy, Social Justice, and Their Role in Promoting Cooperation Across Boundaries of Economic, Racial, and Ethnic Difference. So depending on who is practicing it, diplomacy may or may not be used with the goal of promoting social justice. In the case of our three panelists, however, the scholar of religion, the foreign service officer, and the human rights activist, the goal of social justice is central to their work and practice. So before I begin this session, I want to invite our audience members to post their questions for our speakers during our session via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And you can see it just a bit to the right of the center at the bottom of your screen. I will pose these questions to our panelists following their presentation as our time allows. So our first panelist this morning is Chris Tirres, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Community at DePaul University, and he joins us this morning from Chicago. Chris Tirres is a philosopher of religion with a long-standing interest in the social and political dimensions of religious faith. He is the inaugural Endowed Professor of Diplomacy and Interreligious Engagement at the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy. Chris is the author of Aesthetics and the Ethics of Faith, a dialogue between liberationists and pragmatic thought, and the forthcoming book, Liberating Spiritualities in the Americas. Welcome to you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you all. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks to David for organizing this conference, and thanks to all of the other participants who have already been on call in this conference. I learned a lot from all of the remarks yesterday, and I look forward to our discussions today. And I look forward to our continued collaborations with every single person who has participated in this event in the years to come at the Gray School. So let me just begin by saying that one of the most exciting things for me coming into this discussion of applied diplomacy are the similarities that I see with philosophical pragmatism, which is one of my primary areas of study. As you all may know, philosophical pragmatism, like applied diplomacy, is not equivalent to a crass utilitarianism, as the everyday use of the word pragmatic might suggest. Rather, it is a highly contextual and anti-foundational mode of thinking that values communal inquiry and that positions itself as a tool for social criticism. I am indebted to the work of classical pragmatists like John Dewey and William James, as well as the work of contemporary pragmatists like Cornel West, Eddie Glaude Jr., and Gregory Fernando Papas. So to give you a brief picture of the compatibility I see between pragmatism and professional diplomacy, allow me to draw a brief sketch of pragmatism, borrowing from the work of noted philosopher Richard Bernstein. As Bernstein suggests, pragmatism is best understood not so much as a set of doctrines or even as a method, but rather as an ethos that helps us to respond to pressing real-world problems. Bernstein describes 5 themes that characterize the pragmatic ethos, which may be also true of transprofessional diplomacy. Number 1, both are anti-foundational discourses, insofar that they reject the idea that knowledge rests upon fixed and immutable foundations. 2, both espouse a thoroughgoing fallibilism, characteristic of the experimental and democratic habit of mind that holds all knowledge as interpretive, tentative, and always subject to correction. 3, both underscore the social character of the self and the need to nurture a critical community of inquirers. 4, both accept radical contingency and chance as pervasive features of the universe, our inquiries, and our lives. And 5, both pragmatism and transprofessional diplomacy uphold the value of plurality, a plurality of traditions, perspectives, and epistemic orientations. In short, both pragmatism and transprofessional diplomacy can be said to promote an engaged fallibilistic pluralism. In the words of Bernstein, such an orientation, quote, places new responsibilities upon each of us, for it means taking our fallibility seriously, resolving that however much we are committed to our own styles of thinking, we are willing to listen to others without denying or suppressing the otherness of the other. Now, in addition to these 5 characteristics, I would like to identify 2 more. First, both pragmatism and transprofessional diplomacy are highly contextual and melioristic discourses that seek to respond to the realities and the exigencies of today's world. Both respond to concrete, problematic situations in order to transform the course of subsequent experience. This happens through the use of critical intelligence and the creation of new habits and practices. Second, both pragmatism and transprofessional diplomacy are highly empirical discourses, meaning that their object of study is actual experience. Along these lines, one of the most significant aspects of pragmatism is the fact that it approaches experience in terms of the functional interaction between an organism and its environment. At times, this interaction gives rise to moments of convergence and mutual growth. At other times, the relationship between an organism and its environment is marked by points of friction and/or stasis. But rather than approach the organism-environment relationship in the linear terms of inputs and outputs, wherein, for example, the actions of an organism cause a change in the environment, pragmatists take a more capacious view by asking how this relationship functionally reconfigures both the organism and the environment in novel and codependent ways. This pragmatic understanding of experience, with its emphasis on interactions, functional relationships, and mutual growth, informs in part how I come to the study of transprofessional diplomacy and the questions that I have of it, two of which I would like to share now. So my first question is practical in nature and may be posed this way. What are the concrete skills that are necessary for the practice of transprofessional diplomacy, and how can we help students to effectively engage these skills? When reading the insightful article by Constantinu, Cornago, and McConnell that very much anchors this conference, I was struck by the wide range of what has historically qualified as essential diplomatic skills. We know, for instance, that in the 16th century, it was not unheard of expectation that an ambassador be nothing short of a polymath, having mastered theology and sacred letters, all branches of secular knowledge, the whole of philosophy, as well as mastery of civil canon and municipal law. As the profession of diplomacy shifted from the humanistic literati to court nobility, we see how the skills of the diplomat shifted. In the Book of the Courtier, Baldassare Castiglione describes diplomacy in terms of perfecting courtiership, which includes, quote, careful praise as well as praising others, the cultivation of looks and appearances, the acquisition of graceful movements and gestures, employing elegant and tactful writing and speaking, modestly responding to favors and honors. The list goes on and on. Castiglione goes on to say that central to much of these tasks is the art of practicing nonchalance, which, quote, makes whatever one says or does seem uncontrived and effortless. Now fast forward 400 years. DePaul University has just launched the world's first school of applied diplomacy. What are the skills that diplomats need today to meet the challenges of the 21st century? Surely the demands of the present age require something more specific than polymathy, or something much more committed and engaged than the practice of nonchalance. But what specific skills should we be aiming for? As Constantinu, Cornago, and McConnell point out, diplomatic scholarship has tended to highlight three essential sets of skills, which they identify as the following. Number one, skills having to do with deep and nuanced knowledge of others. Number two, skills in advocacy, which involve defending or promoting a case. And three, skills in maintaining composure and working relationships with an eye on attaining objectives and negotiating agreements. In many ways, these skills are not too different from the soft skills commonly associated with the humanities. For example, DePaul's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences identifies 5 key learning outcomes in their liberal studies program. 3 of these outcomes speak to the essential skills identified by Constantinu, Cornago, and McConnell. And I'm just going to share my screen here just so you can get a sense of this overlap. You can have a look. So you see on the left, the skills identified, and then on the right, what the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, what some of their key learning goals are. So the good news here is that the Gray School has a very supportive home in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Both units clearly share some common core aims. That said, some folks may still wonder, what is particularly distinctive about the learning aims of the Gray School as compared to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences? On the one hand, it is clear that the Gray School's scholarly study of diplomacy provides valuable new intellectual content for the college. But if we were to focus on the question of skills, what is especially distinctive about the Gray School? I think one answer to this question has a lot to do with the manner in which the Gray School seeks to engage these learning outcomes. In particular, the Gray School has committed itself to 3 priority areas which are made public on its website. And they're listed right here. The Gray School will increase study abroad opportunities for students who might not otherwise be able to afford it, to transform the demographic profile of college graduates who apply for jobs in diplomacy, and 3, connect faculty and students with professional and citizen diplomats. All 3 of these aims speak directly to embodied and/or engaged forms of intercultural and global understanding. The first and the third items listed here provide students with forms of learning that go well beyond content-based intellectual knowledge. Such high-impact practices also engage students at the emotional, sensorial, imaginative, and existential levels of learning. From a research perspective, much could be written in the field of the scholarship of teaching and learning about the pedagogical value of the applied diplomacy as a form of engaged learning. The second priority area, number 2 here, is also quite significant. If one of the major learning objectives of the Gray School is to expand intercultural and global understanding, then it would make sense for the school to recruit applicants for whom intercultural and global understanding is already a part of their lived reality. The authors of the article Transprofessional Diplomacy speak of the value of hybrid and liminal perspectives of diplomacy. And indeed, we can use the scholarly work of Homi Bhabha, W.E.B. Du Bois, or Gloria Anzaldúa, and a host of others to unpack the meaning of cultural hybridity, double consciousness, or a borderland sensibility. But as Antonio Alejo pointed out yesterday, we can also learn from people on the ground, such as those who have recently been deported, who know a thing or two about what it means to be neither here nor there. And even closer to home, we can draw on the wisdom and insights of DePaul's diverse student population who already have firsthand experience with liminality and hybridity. All of these priorities, of course, require resources. And it is no small miracle that in this time of scarcity and uncertainty, we have the resources at the Gray School with which to work. It is my hope that we keep these 3 priority areas front and center in the years to come, for they add significantly to the ways in which key learning goals, like intercultural and global understanding, are carried out. My second question is more theoretical in nature and has to do with the normative claims of diplomacy. And the question can be framed this way. Given the fact that diplomacy has historically been tied to the needs and interests of the nation state, how can we think through applied diplomacy beyond the epistemic limits of the nation state? In other words, are there ways to engage and promote the praxis of applied diplomacy while at the same time keeping in check its epistemic baggage? I raise this question because, as we all know, the very concept of the modern nation state is rife with epistemic traps, especially when we consider the linkages between modern nation states, the rise of global capitalism in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the exploitation of natural resources and human bodies in Africa and the Americas. As the field of decolonial thought teaches us, global capitalism is as much an economic system that exploits surplus labor as it is an epistemic matrix of colonial power that relies on totalizing forms of knowledge. Seen from a decolonial perspective, applied diplomacy must wrestle with the epistemic context from which it arises, which has a lot to do with the projects of capitalism and colonialism. As Sam Opondo pointed out yesterday, applied diplomacy must keep ethically vigilant in wrestling with what he calls the entanglements and complicities of diplomacy. Now, of course, the idea of applied or transprofessional diplomacy is itself an attempt to think beyond the usual conceptual limits of traditional diplomacy, rather than position itself as a deprofessionalization of diplomacy. Transprofessional diplomacy seeks to expand the conceptual boundaries of diplomacy through more pluralistic and democratic renderings of the concept. In short, the normative understandings of what diplomacy is has failed to fully respond to the socio-economic, cultural, political, environmental, and technological complexity of our day. As the authors of Transprofessional Diplomacy point out, transprofessional diplomacy attempts to fill this gap by expanding what counts as diplomacy and who de facto can do it. Now, I believe that all of this is a step in the right direction. And again, we are fortunate to have the institutional heft of the Gray School to help us do the work of both traditional and applied diplomacy. That said, I wonder if the conceptual boundaries around the idea of applied diplomacy can be pushed even further. In asking this question, my aim here is not to render the concept of diplomacy obsolete, but rather to think through other entry points for imagining diplomacy. In this respect, I appreciate Kostas Konstantinou's remarks yesterday that invite us to see transprofessional diplomacy in ways that are cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and perhaps even post-disciplinary. Such approaches will help to equip us with alternative vocabularies and understandings of diplomacy. I have a little more. I'm over time. I'll stop there. I look forward to the other presentations. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much for framing so many of those pedagogical and intellectual approaches to our work. It's a good framework for us to begin our work today. So I'd like to introduce now our second panelist, Caroline Savage, who is a U.S. Foreign Service officer who's joining us today from Washington, D.C. Caroline Savage is a career U.S. Foreign Service officer who has served most recently as the director of the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Press Center. She is currently in training for her next position as Consul General in Almaty, Kazakhstan. A Rusk Fellow at Georgetown University, her research focuses on diverse diplomacy leadership in foreign affairs. She has served as public affairs officer at U.S. embassies in Azerbaijan and Mozambique, and was the director for Russia and Central Asia on the National Security Council. Welcome to you, Caroline.
Well, thanks, David, for the kind introduction and really for the chance to be here with you today. I was just really reflecting upon how amazing it is that we were together just about a year ago for the launch of the Gray School. It was such a joy to be together in person in Chicago, and it's great to reconnect with this community of really like-minded and passionate people across disciplines, certainly, as Chris noted, and maybe post-disciplinarily passionate about diplomacy, which certainly for me has been a vocation throughout my career. I think I was an undergraduate when I realized, like, this is what I want to do with my life, and haven't looked back since 16 years in. But opportunities to step outside of the daily work of traditional diplomacy and actually have the sort of conversations and connections with folks like yourselves is really also a true joy and great opportunity for me personally. I was reading the fantastic article you sent about Konstantinou's sort of concept about everyday diplomacy and this notion of democratizing the idea of who could be a diplomat. And, I couldn't help but just feel really strongly that maybe at this moment today more than ever, it's even more important to really expand our concept of who can be a diplomat. I think even before COVID, it's fair to say across the world that our global challenges have really become more complex than ever. And I'd say it's certainly abroad, but also really within our country, the need to really bridge the gaps between people whose outlooks and perspectives differ becomes just increasingly and more abundantly clear all the time. And it's through the kind of common understanding that folks who are doing that hard work of building the bridges and talking to the people whose views are different than theirs, that we get the kinds of public policy and foreign policy solutions and action plans and ways forward that both can endure and that people can support. And as I see it, diplomacy really is at its core is about respect and empathy at a very human level. Certainly this is not a proprietary concept for just people who work at the State Department. It's I think a broadly human concept. Successful diplomats, to me, of any ilk that take the time to do the investigation and the work to understand their interlocutors, especially people who are sort of from a different place or from a different perspective than they are, and understand their core beliefs and their value systems, are the most successful diplomats, and I mean that broadly, that we can have. So for traditional diplomats, we spend a lot of time in training, both sort of official training and then personal training, working on language, as I am now, as David mentioned, studying Kazakh language, but also the culture and history of the people who we're going to work with. I think, well, at the State Department, and certainly throughout the world, traditional diplomats try to advance the national interests of our countries. That's what we're here to do. We're most effective when we're able to both choose the most compelling arguments for our individual and localized audiences, but also then feed back into and play a really important part in the policy-making process that takes that deep understanding of what policies will be both acceptable, but also appealing to other peoples, and use that to shape our policies. So, that sort of, it's really a two-way street. The most knowledgeable, locally knowledgeable, culturally sensitive people who are doing the work on the ground and are able to connect and understand different points of view, and maybe empathize with those, even if we don't share those. Those are the people who can help make the most effective policies and approaches to diplomacy. So yes, I think it's fair to say this core work is certainly not proprietary to traditional diplomacy. On the contrary, this ability to speak to different peoples and different cultures with different views can and should increasingly be done by non-traditional diplomats to help sort of enrich the information and understanding about the people and the cultures and the countries in which we work. Now, David had posed this question to us prior to this panel about, proxy diplomats and to the extent to which proxy diplomats play a role in diplomacy as well. And in certainly traditional diplomacy, I think to a certain extent, proxy diplomats have been around for a long time, but especially since the rise of social media and sort of a 24/7 information culture, I'd say that especially in the field of public diplomacy, the sort of subfield of public diplomacy, there's a growing recognition of the incredible power of proxy diplomats, that is non-foreign service officer diplomats have and have the promise to play. I guess first I'd say there's always this issue of covering the territory. I always think about, every country that I've served in. I served in Luxembourg, which was rather small, but even there it was impossible to be everywhere. But I served in Mozambique as well, a country twice the size of California. I mean, no matter what the size of the embassy, there's no way to cover the physical spaces. And so, I think for a long time, the State Department has recognized the incredible multiplier effects of additional Americans to living and working overseas. We have this whole range of State Department programs bringing Fulbright scholars in both directions and students as well. But, outside academic and professional exchanges are as powerful, as far as I've seen, as some of the state-sponsored programs. For example, we had a UCLA fellow at the Central Hospital in Maputo helping with infant pediatrics and maternal care. And, she brought her expertise, but also her humanity to a whole community of, scholars and medical practitioners. And, just being there every day in that kind of professional exchange was incredibly powerful. But, the Peace Corps as well, I'd say, those are Generally, I don't think exclusively. There are sometimes 65-year-old Peace Corps volunteers. I've met a few, but tend to be young people who move abroad, and they work in the most rural, often rural, but kind of disparate locations throughout a country. And they, help with various projects, from English teaching to agriculture to public health. And I found those to be some of the most impressive non-traditional diplomats that I've seen in action. We had over 160 in Mozambique, which was a help at sort of the scale of the project of reaching the Mozambican people. But any rural area that I would ever go to that ever had a Peace Corps volunteer, we would hear all about them, chapter and verse. And it was not just what they did professionally, but their sort of human connection that they made with their local communities that was really impactful and memorable for the people. And I think almost without exception made a hugely positive and long-term impact. Also would say on this issue of proxy diplomats become, in addition to the sort of beyond the challenge of scale, proxies can be very, very helpful with authenticity, this authenticity challenge that, being a State Department person now for 16 years, I still feel the difference between being a student and an exchange student in Russia and being an official American. And no matter how attuned or linguistically savvy or culturally savvy I am, there's still times when I realize I'm not, or the U.S. government or the U.S. ambassador is not going to be the best spokesperson for every issue that the U.S. government's trying to support, just by virtue of being part of the government. There's always this sort of question of motive that can come up as to why we're doing that thing or saying that thing. Shaping public opinion, which is something that we do try to do overseas, it's really not just about a great interview with the ambassador, but rather shaping and influencing a positive sort of collective view of the United States is really complex and layered. Our embassies overseas will look for U.S. exchange program alumni who are from the local culture, an entrepreneur or a celebrity who might share our views or our interests, and maybe just find out what they're doing and help to build their platform, help to give them, public support or platforms to speak, or set them up on an exchange program or a professional development program where they can develop their skills and grow and come back to be sort of stronger and more impactful at what they're already working on. Sort of a similar vein, I feel as though proxies have been really helpful in my work, particularly in sensitive areas or in areas involving like attitudinal or behavioral change, which is always sensitive, right? Especially if the United States government or any government is trying to move in that direction. But just as one example, a big focus in many of the Southern African states, but in other places around the world, is HIV/AIDS assistance. And a key issue we found in Mozambique was the stigma issue in especially local communities, but throughout Mozambique, in sort of telling their communities that they were going to take antiretrovirals. So visiting a clinic to get free antiretrovirals would be impeded by the sense that if people know that I have HIV, I will be not accepted any longer, or worse. In that case, we were really working hard. There was over $300 million a year put towards HIV/AIDS relief efforts and education and healthcare efforts in Mozambique. And we had somewhat of a windfall when we met a former WNBA player who was Mozambican born and had moved back from America. And she was passionate about the cause of tackling the HIV/AIDS crisis and said, "What can I do to help?" We were like, "What can you do to help? Like, have we got an idea for you? How about some basketball clinics all over the country? Because people might come to hear you talk about basketball and healthy living and healthy lifestyles, and find out about HIV and AIDS, treatment options and just general and preventative education before they're going to come and hear me give a passionate speech about, HIV/AIDS, which, just people who aren't already in that community might not be motivated to come out to do, whereas they might go to the basketball clinic with the star. And they did. They came out in droves, and it was one of the most effective diplomacy programs that I think I've ever been involved with. So, David also asked us what kind of diplomatic corps is needed to most effectively respond to today's challenges. To me, in this intensely complex world with the intensely localized challenges that we have all over the world to try to understand and get on top of, I feel as though it's a no-brainer to me that the most representative diplomatic corps that shows a full spectrum of U.S. society will give us the best shot at doing the best job as U.S. diplomats. And I mean, representing America's full sort of potential and power as a nation with regards to gender, geography, socioeconomic, ethnicity, sexuality, race. This is not entirely unique, but I think a major strategic advantage that the United States has. So we have people from all over the world who understand the world in different ways and understand different facets of the world's complexities. So, in addition to it being the right thing to do to recruit and retain people from all of those walks of life, I also feel as though, for the State Department in particular, but even beyond that, for us to leverage the power of the United States example, we need to draw from all of those communities and all of this understanding and nuance and knowledge those communities have. At the same time, even if you don't buy the sort of values-based or the realpolitik version of why we need to have diverse diplomats, every study out there again and again shows that more diverse organizations make more effective and innovative organizations. We make better decisions when our boards and our senior leaders and our decision makers are from more diverse walks of life, because they understand the different angles and friction points and perspectives that different people have and can help to address them. Naturally, this applies to our foreign policy as well. And I personally see it as a national security imperative to ensure that our diplomatic tables and foreign affairs organizations of every kind are balanced with all of America's diversity. And if you're interested in learning more about sort of diverse diplomats and whether there are careers for you in the traditional realm, there is a great series that I'm thrilled to have been a part of and still be a part of that Georgetown's Institute for Study of Diplomacy is supporting again for a third year. It's the Diverse Diplomacy Leaders Series. And we have a website, diversediplomacy.com, where I had the chance to interview a number of fantastic diplomats from a whole range of different backgrounds, who really candidly and sometimes amusingly, but in a very real way, talk about the challenges and rewards of the career, as well as the barriers they've faced at home and abroad, and how they've dealt with those to try to do the sort of creative and sometimes taxing, but ultimately, I think, rewarding work of diplomacy. But I'd conclude by saying, because I think I'm almost over my time too, that you don't necessarily have to be an FSO, a Foreign Service Officer, or a State Department person. If you're willing to do the work and step outside the bubble, whatever the bubble is that you're in, to listen and learn and connect, especially when it's not easy, we certainly need you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And I see a theme developing in this panel so far, and that's diversity of knowledge. And so thank you so much for that wonderful contribution. I'd like to now turn to introducing our third panelist, Mohammed Abu Bakr, who is the president of the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, and he joins us today from Washington, D.C. as well. A Sudanese human rights activist, Mohammed is the founder of the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, a Washington, D.C.-based NGO dedicated to mobilizing, empowering, and uniting young millennial leaders from across Africa and the Middle East to become leaders and builders of resilient, inclusive societies. He is also the founder of the AMA Leadership Institute, which equips young activists from the MENA region with practical knowledge and skills so that they can carry out their civil society activism more safely and effectively. I'd like to welcome you, Mohammed.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. I hope you are keeping safe and healthy wherever you are. And my name is Mohammed. I'm from Khartoum, Sudan, born and raised, and lived until about 2016 when I moved to the United States and started the AML project. I come from a different world than Caroline and Chris in terms of career. I am a human rights advocate. I've been in the human rights sector since I was 14 years old. Started my career working in Sudan, across conflict zones in Sudan, since 2003, since the outbreak of the war in Darfur. And up until I'm an engineer by training, but up until I moved to the United States, I've been doing human rights, conflict management, and peace building in the level of Sudan, locally, on the MENA region, regionally, and on more global level, also through a third organization. I've been running through three organizations simultaneously when I was living in Sudan, and up until 2016, and until I started AML project, which is an attempt to continue to do that all that work all at once from one single organization. Since a very young age, I had to be in the shoes of a citizen diplomat, and to represent interests of some communities, to state actors, to traditional diplomats, track one diplomats, from various missions in Sudan. And it was always a challenge finding that, lingo where we can actually connect and actually exchange the needed knowledge for interest of all parties to be represented. I worked with the U.S. Embassy quite a lot, as well as embassies of other countries. For example, speaking on behalf of Darfurians who have been going through a genocide at the time, that required a lot of communication with a lot of partners, and representing interest of communities that otherwise would have zero voice and would not be able to communicate their grievances, and to represent them to actors who could do something about it, including the United States, including the United Nations, and other bodies that are in place of power to do something about it. I'm so glad that I got to talk last, because I think I'm going to build all what I'm going to say on what Caroline and Chris just said. In dealing as an everyday diplomat, as a citizen diplomat, I think what would make my life, what would have made my life so much easier if I was able to, if I was able to connect better with traditional diplomats. I keep thinking to the point of, Chris alluded to, he said the number one needed skill is a deep understanding of the other. And Caroline beautifully said, our ability to empathize with points of view of the people that you work with. I think one very important part for that understanding is not diversity in its shallow definition, but really true diversity, one that enables an aging nation like United States and Japan to connect with very youthful continent of Africa. For that, you can't just read about it. It's not something that you you can learn in a school. It's something that you are is equally important. Who you are is equally important in order to be able to connect fully with counterparts on the other side, but also in order to be truly empathetic to their points of view. Who you are is as equally as important as what you know and what you read and what you study in preparation for your mission. In my work, I got to work with in several contexts. Each is a little bit different. Working, having to negotiate with militia members in conflict zones all the time is a bit different from working with the Israelis and Palestinians, for example, and trying to be the diplomat in that space and work and talking to Israelis and Palestinians is very, not entirely different, but in a way different from talking to state representatives like Caroline and traditional diplomats. But after a while, it becomes easier for every activist to be able to connect with all these parties, with all these different people. There is a lingo that gets learned along the way. Sadly, it's not something that you can study as an activist. I actually, until I heard of Grace School, I didn't know of such institution, and I don't think there is still anywhere in the world such institution that actually intentionally tries to take everyday regular activists and give them a spot in the space of diplomacy. That's not being done on institutional level, and I think it would be a game changer to redefine what diplomacy is and to set the acknowledgement of people in civil society spaces who do actually practice diplomacy on daily basis as citizen diplomat. I think that's going to be a game changer for a lot of the work that we do, and I think our effectiveness will only increase if we marry these words a little better, the word of activists and the word of diplomats, and have that relationship become more institutionalized and more mainstreamed. Caroline touched on a very interesting anecdote on the HIV example that she provided. I think that is at the core of why this word is really needed. The work that she does on that you didn't talk about right now, but I heard from David about on inclusion, on diversification of the foreign service. It's needed because it's the example of the HIV that you provided illustrates a disconnect, and like the fact that it took so long to come up with that idea comes from an inherent flaw with the way we do diplomacy, in my opinion, at least. The way I've seen it, working with embassy representatives, mission representatives, not just from the United States, but also from Europe and others, that it takes often so long for them to find that realization that, okay, maybe we listen to, we should actually connect more with the local organizations and others and take their advice on what works. And that sadly changes every few years with the mission individuals changing. That learning process starts all over again from scratch. And that's been a pattern for the last 20 years. It's like, okay, comes the new administration, comes new diplomats, they start the learning process. By the third or fourth year, they come to something really great like that initiative. And just when things are starting to get great and the relationship gets built, people change, and staffers change, and the realization has to be built from scratch. And I think that is actually inherent flaw with the way we do, with the way the State Department is structured, but not only the State Department, but it's also other missions around the world. Some are doing a lot better than others in maintaining those lessons learned, but the United States could use a lot of work. The State Department could use a lot of the work that Caroline, I know, is trying to do. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Well, I wanted to follow up with a question that really goes to the theme of our conference. And that is, in light of all of your observations, coming from the different perspectives that you all have with regards to the study and practice of diplomacy, I'm wondering, what do you believe are the next concrete steps which must be taken in order to deepen collaboration among governmental and non-governmental diplomatic actors? And I'm struck by the fact that there were some themes that came up in all of your comments that I just want to draw attention to before I put this to you. And of course, Chris talked with us about the value of plurality, and of course the pluralism of diplomacy, the reality that diplomacy is practiced in many different venues through many different vocations, and the idea of the necessity for having deep and nuanced knowledge of others and maintaining relationships. And then Caroline spoke of the absolute centrality and necessity for respect and empathy. And of course, the diversity of knowledge, which is embodied in the work that she is doing in increasing the diversity of the Foreign Service of the United States. And then finally, I really like what Mohammed had to say about who you are and what you know are in fact both equally important. And speaking for myself, one of the fields of diplomacy that has long captured my imagination is environmental diplomacy, and the idea that even though we come from many different walks of life and many experiences, there's three things we all have in common. We all need clean water, arable land, and breathable air. And these things necessitate cooperation. And yet at the same time, because of the complexity of the ecosystem, it's impossible. As Caroline was pointing out, you can be in one part of a country and yet other things are going on 50 miles away, perhaps even 8 miles away, that one is not able to completely grasp because one has a particular perspective. So I think that the question of whether or not collaboration is important has probably already been answered, or at least that's my position. But how do we get there? And I'm really fascinated to hear each one of you speak to that, because I don't think that anybody has necessarily cornered the market on how we can answer this question comprehensively. I think the answers come from many perspectives. So I commend that question to all three of you. And anybody who wants to take it first, please do so.
I'm happy to start. Yes, I think you're right. I think the question of whether we should, we're all in violent agreement that we should, right? And I guess, my perspective after 16 years in this career, I've seen varying ways and varying, circumstances as to how we have and haven't, at least as from the traditional diplomacy side, made space and room and prioritized or not prioritized the kinds of interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary communications that Chris was referring to. From the Washington and policy side, with some of the big relationships like U.S.-Russia relationship or U.S.-China relationship, or some of the conflict areas, we'll have the track 2. But U.S.-Russia relationship, when I worked on that, we were doing summits all the time and having at the same time business and civil society summits that were sponsored. Like we got USAID funding to help bring civil society organizations from different groups together, and business groups from Russia and the US together. And I know that the US-China strategic and economic dialogue has similarly prioritized that sort of thing. But Mohammed's comments remind me that, on most other fronts, I think it's less institutionalized, those kinds of contacts. Even at the embassies overseas, there's a lot of dependency on individual sort of will and focus, and capacity, I think, at its core, about whether or not the staff at a given embassy has the ability, the time, and the focus to reach out to think tanks, academics, civil society actors, and then to what extent they manage to make time for that in their given days and weeks that are usually packed. And I guess this, for me at least, from the state institutional perspective, I feel like I have to mention that state is so underfunded and understaffed in so many ways, that we often want to do better on these fronts and then fail to do so, or fail to meet the sort of bar that we would consider acceptable, or even desirable. I personally have felt this in many of my jobs, though I was the one who was bringing in the think tank organizations and the professors to brief the US-Russia desk on the history of the relationship and what we should do now. It was only because I'd had an academic career previously that I was able to draw upon those communities and not just jump into my next job. It's Mohammed, sort of, you're like nodding, because I think you've known enough diplomats to know people are often just moving across the world every 2 or 3 years and trying to get up to speed and get their feet under them and move themselves physically and emotionally into their new spaces, and don't have the space really to do everything, all the deep work that they might want to do. Just as a point of example, I read recently that the military has more people in their military bands than the entire State Department has for personnel. This is not a joke, this is actually true. And I think it's a reflection of, a long trajectory of sort of militarization of our foreign policy, but also sort of a deep inequity when it comes to funding and investment in our human resources. Because, I had the great opportunity 2 years ago to take a whole year away from the State Department, like intensity of work, and go to Georgetown and sort of slow down, think more deeply, do sort of my own research and investigative work, and longer term projects and thinking and teaching. But those fellowship programs, those detail programs, graduate school opportunities are so few and far between. They're hotly competed every year, that most people don't have the chance to do that. And again, to compare with the military, where every 2 to 3 years, people are taking a year or 2 years away in order to go on a detail, go on a training, read and think and reflect. And then during those years, you have the space to do what I did and go to the International Studies Association conference in Toronto and meet David Wellman and other like-minded, sort of passionate people, but from different disciplines completely. I found it to be so enriching myself personally, and I know my colleagues do too. So to address the sort of issue of why aren't those state people able to meet with every activist that deserves to be met with, I think we really have to tackle the critical human resource deficit, where you don't have enough people, and those people are too strapped with their constant moves into a new job, and then the staffing gaps in many parts of the world are still very acute. I know, especially across Africa, many of the embassies are understaffed compared to what their staffing patterns would require. They're often at 50% or less. So, I won't go too deeply into how many people we've lost in the last few years, but I think it's 30% of our senior foreign service has also retired since 2017. We have major gaps to make up in terms of promotion and positions, but also in terms of hiring and retention of the kinds of diverse diplomats that we really need to be ready and focused and able to have the important conversations both, with academics and activists and people outside of traditional diplomacy, and the school and the efforts like the Gray School is making to really tear down the stovepipes and bring all of us together, I think is a huge contribution to the overall effort. I applaud you. I really, in addition to building the interdisciplinary skills in the students to do this kind of interdisciplinary, post-disciplinary work, but to build bridges between practitioners and academic communities, I think is really an essential component to preparing to tackle the challenges of tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Would somebody else like to speak to this question?
Sure, yeah, I'll say, go ahead, Mohammed.
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
All right, so I just want to build again on what Caroline just said. And yeah, like funding is a real issue here. And the United States in particular, if we can just focus on the United States for a second, is really regressing. It used to be, probably the state with most soft power across the world. Programs like Peace Corps and others were like unmatched by any other nation. That is sadly is in decline, is not growing when it's actually more needed now than ever. The capacity of these programs are not growing; they're actually shrinking. And the presence of diplomatic corps and staff is shrinking to a dangerous level in places that we really don't know. Speaking as an American now, we really don't know much about much of these countries where we have 7 people representing the entire country of the United States. We have that is unhealthy and not good for the United States interest in a lot of these countries, and we need to ramp up the funding for the diplomatic arm of the United States. It's certainly as important, if not more important, than the military arm, and funding is just not there right now, and there is a need for advocates in the United States to start compelling Congress to spend more on that, and that's just sadly not happening right now.
Thank you, Mohammed. Chris?
So to return to your original question, what are the next steps that could be done? I mean, I think that Caroline and Mohammed have really alerted us to the fact that there are some significant practical constraints when it comes to these kinds of dialogues. If you don't have people in place, it's very difficult to have these kinds of dialogues. So I think the question can be answered, in a number of ways. In terms of the study of diplomacy, in terms of a more research-oriented, what are the next steps? I think a related possibility could be to really foreground and put front and center the experiences, the on-the-ground experiences of those who actually practice diplomacy, whether they're track 1, 2, or 3 diplomats. So yesterday, for example, there were a couple of comments that folks were making something along the lines of folks who are actually doing the work of diplomacy are in some ways much farther ahead than the scholars who are working on transprofessional diplomacy, because they realize how malleable diplomatic skills must be to meet all of these changing landscapes. So it was suggested yesterday that, yeah, transprofessional diplomacy makes sense because that's what people already are doing and they have to do in order to meet all of the different needs and commitments and values that are presented to them. But again, just to focus more on the research question, I mean, I think that if we foreground the practice, the actual practice of transprofessional diplomacy, actually the question of experience and practice becomes central. So to the extent that we can build these new vocabularies of transprofessional diplomacy, build these new understandings, I think it would be great to root all of that in the nitty-gritty practice of transprofessional diplomacy. So to really take a deep dive into what, for example, Constantinou and McConnell and Cornago called the phenomenology of transprofessional diplomacy, what actually is happening in terms of the experience that is co-created when you're actually working through these diplomatic challenges. How does experience come together? How does it change mutually? How does it grow? Which I think is, a really fascinating question, for scholars to ask. But I think it has real applicability and real importance for those who actually practice transprofessional diplomacy. So in order, just to sum this all up, I think just to recognize that diplomacy should begin and end in practice. And if in fact that is the case on a practical level, the research should also follow that lead. You need to do a deep dive into what it means to practice both on a practical level and a theoretical level, and then return to practice. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'd like to turn now to some questions from our audience. But before I do so, just listening to the three of you, I was remembering a panel that we had yesterday, and it was of three very dynamic young citizen diplomats who work in Europe, Jews and Muslims, who have really created a network, extraordinary network between three organizations, the Muslim-Jewish Conference, Connecting Actions, and Coexiste. And between these three people we had yesterday, they've literally reached hundreds of thousands of people that they have created in a network. They have invited young people to look at what are the requirements for building bridges, what are the barriers that each person has within them that has prevented them up until now from realizing their potential as bridge builders and as empathizers. And the question was asked, would you think of yourself as a diplomat? And the answer that all three of these people had to say is, well, I would never claim that for myself, because I was told that was a very elite sort of title, and it conveys a level of prestige that I would not name for myself as that would be egotistical. And yet in another panel, we had a young woman, Sana Said, who works for the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And she had a different answer. And she just said that we need to claim this title of diplomat for ourselves when we are practicing this. This is no longer an exclusively elite title. This is absolutely necessary for us to claim. And so this question for me that comes from the audience is so perfect. It frames it so well. It says, in the working of democratizing diplomacy, who confers legitimacy? Who can say who is a diplomat? And that is the question I want to pose to the three of you now.
So just very briefly, let me add one other layer to the discussion. So there was also a discussion yesterday of how some who practice citizen diplomacy, sometimes they don't want to claim the title of diplomat, given the negative connotations that term may also entail, right? So this sense that you're just a utilitarian functionary of the state, right? And you're just trying to push forward a certain agenda. So I think that's the first level. What diplomacy are we talking about? If we're not talking about that kind of diplomacy, if we're talking about this other thing called citizen diplomacy or transprofessional diplomacy, which has everything to do with values like social justice, then can we begin to claim them? And I think that opens the doors. I think you're absolutely right, and so it invites people to begin to claim this. Just two quick responses. I think, first of all, the question of legitimacy is always contextual. So to claim the term diplomacy may make sense in certain contexts, but not in others. But that said, I also think, and I'm hearing this theme emerge, just the power of institutions to legitimize the very concept of transprofessional diplomacy is also key. So I think to that extent, DePaul has a huge responsibility, and other universities like Georgetown, who do fantastic work in diplomacy, have a huge responsibility in terms of really helping students who go through these programs to unpack all of the ways that diplomacy is entangled and complicit in all these different systems of power, but then to bring forth the best that it has to offer in terms of promoting these kinds of values, peace and social justice and empathy and respect and so forth. So, so I do think that the question of institutions is key, and I think that we're at quite a remarkable moment with the Gray School, you know, to be able to offer this kind of legitimacy.
Yes, I guess I would jump in and just violently agree again with that, but also to say, you know, this sort of question of someone bestowing, I think there's this implication of who's bestowing this legitimacy implicit in that, and I'm not sure that there needs to be some kind of arbiter on, you know, whether you are or aren't a diplomat. To me, you know, as I said, the core work really is about deciding in yourself. It's really a matter of disposition and intent and focus, right? Rather than title, as to whether or not you're choosing to do this work. And I think it's important perhaps to understand that you are doing this very important work and that there's a higher cause to this. It's not just a hobby to learn about someone new and then try to talk with them, but you're trying to build a bridge and attempt to get to some kind of greater, deeper understanding through that. I think perhaps there is a value in at least conferring the legitimacy upon yourself and giving yourself that title and saying, this is the important work that I am doing as I choose, and I'm called to do it, for what it's worth.
I am, again, at the risk of repeating myself, I agree with everybody here, with both, with both points made. I'm also one of those uncomfortable with the term myself, but again, the only thing that would help mainstream that term is for academic institutions to give that, to make that term more mainstream, more acknowledged. And I really commend DePaul for taking the initiative in doing this.
Well, I would just like to say I've not taken the last word in any of these panels. I like to leave it to you, but I just want to say something from the privilege of my perspective of getting to work both with citizen diplomats and foreign service officers, is that I see such a pluralism among all of these groups. And I think that there is a bit of a myth that says that all foreign service officers are lockstep with their respective governments that they represent. Of course, their mission is, their obligation is to represent their country, and that, of course, is central to the work. But at the same time, I see so much nuance and interpretation of what it means to be of service to others, to be of service to one's country, and to be of service to the people that one is working with in other countries. That I see possibilities in all three tracks for this tremendous work of empathy and advocacy for social justice. And that's, of course, why I invited all three of you to this panel. But I also want to say that, I am just struck by the fact that all the people who have showed up in this conference so far, to me, embody the best of what diplomacy can be. And I know that I have the privilege as an academic that I get to speak in ideal terms if I wish to. And I think that I love the fact that we can, at the Gray School, invite people to imagine what diplomacy can be and what diplomacy should be. And there's not one answer to that question, I'm happy to say, but to whatever degree, taking off on what Mohammed had to say, to whatever degree that our school can help convey that legitimacy to these other practitioners, I very much hope that we can make that contribution. Because as I said, when I looked at, for example, the panel yesterday of the NGO leaders from Europe, I saw three brilliant and dynamic young diplomats. If they had ever, whether or not they had ever considered thinking of themselves in those terms, I can see them in no other term but that. And it gives me tremendous hope for this world and our future. So Mohammed Abu Bakr, Chris Tirres, and Caroline Savage, I want to thank you so much for your contributions to this panel. And on behalf of the Gray School, I look forward to welcoming you all here. Well, one of you, Chris, you are here, but I look forward to welcoming Mohammed and Caroline back to Chicago soon when we're able to be face-to-face. But I'm so happy to be in this virtual space with you today. So we're going to take a break now, and at 30 minutes past the hour, we're going to resume with our final panel entitled Diplomacy, the COVID-19 Pandemic, and the New Emerging Diplomatic Landscape. Please join us for that panel, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you.
All of you, David. Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.